So I feel very honored to be here. Also a little bit surprised. As Jens contacted me, I say, well, I'm a quantitative researcher. So do I really fit in this conference? But I think, Jens, you assured me that there may be something. And so I'm actually going to say that I learned a lot from your presentations, including a lot of the very good work being done in international markets. What I propose to do today is to talk about some of the questions. So I always felt that quantitative research is very good in terms of the what and how much, and in my research, the when question. So I typically come in, and I'm just going to skip to that one, by the way. I'm typically coming in this picture. So companies contact me to say, look, we have this money to spend. And on all these different marketing actions, search engine optimization, advertising new products, how does that really drive consumers' attitudes? And what they do online too. So I typically look at long series of clicks and sales leads, and then ultimately I calculate, everybody knows that some of that goes down the toilet. And that only some of it, so this is the stereotype of a marketeer that shouts from the roofs, and this is the stereotypical finance person, or the CEO, that says, well, what of that is really translated into return on investment? So what I've been doing for lots of years is to calculate return on investment. And then when I try to apply this to emerging market, I see that very often I didn't do my qualitative part right. And that feeds back into how do you get the kind of right data doesn't have any stickers yet, right? How do you get the right qualitative and quantitative data to really answer some of these questions? And so please feel free to interrupt me with any questions or clarifications you have here. So the three things that I would love to do is, first of all, well, why are your clients interested in emerging markets? I feel it comes from two sides, and I've worked in both. So if you talk to companies like Procter & Gamble, they're very concerned. Even just competing with Unilever and Colgate, they're telling me, look, we have to grow twice as fast because we're much more present in mature markets, which are naturally not growing as much as some of the emerging markets where Unilever is very strong in. So when I'm just writing up my first book, and when I was interviewing the P&G guy in China who said yes to it, it was the headquarters who told me, no, you can't interview him. Interview a P&G person in the US or Germany, we don't care, but we really want to kind of succeed in China, and that's very important for us, and we don't want anything to leak out from this perspective. And so at the same time, and I'm going to come back to that one at the end of my presentation, at the same time you now see very strong brands from emerging markets. So think about Lenovo, think about brands coming from other places that have made it very big in their own home market of Brazil or Turkey, and that are now trying to become very popular in mature markets. And just like I feel that a lot of people from mature markets don't really understand the emerging market consumer, I feel that likewise people that have been born in emerging markets don't really get the mature market consumer. And so there is where a lot of the research that you can do comes in. And so there's enormous budgets, as I was talking to people in Turkey. So Turkish companies realize that they have to build a brand specifically in US and Western Europe. And there's a lot of qualitative research needed for them to understand what it takes for them to succeed in those markets. So there's a lot of institutional, cultural, economic differences. I call this breaking the ice, ICE, with your customers, and it can show up in very different ways. And you guys already know this. It can come up in what your words mean and the concepts mean in emerging markets versus mature market. It comes up in how people react to advertising and communication, which I've seen in my research, and then ultimately also how they respond to marketing and what the client's results are from this. So just as an overview, then I'll talk just one slide about the first topic and the second one. And then I'm going to present you one of my research topics that started off quantitatively and then I think needs a lot of qualitative insights that we can have some fruitful discussion about how these two different ways can get us better insights. And that's applied to a Brazil versus the UK analysis. So what do your research work mean? When I came to Turkey, so our university started 4.5 years ago. So I was there from the beginning, which was very exciting. And it was the first time I started doing consultancy in Turkey. And there was one specific company from Western Europe that was selling that detergent in Turkey. And they had this new detergent that was very environmentally friendly, but also would cost more. So what they did, instead of doing good qualitative research first, by the way, they right away went to a survey, and we had this very nice survey in Germany and in Turkey, really probing for typically housewives that buy detergents, how important the environment was for them, and specifically how much they were willing to pay for it. So what comes out, do you think, from that survey? What does environment mean in Germany and Turkey? We found a similar level of environmental friendliness in Turkey versus Germany. We found a similar willingness to pay with all the tools that we did between Germany and Turkey. And just as somebody coming straight in Turkey, I told my client this can't be true. So what we did after this one, we did some in-depth interviews, and we just probed people. Well, we asked them, what does environment mean? And so Turkish consumers, they had very similar enthusiasm about this environmentally friendly product. But what they meant was my home, my family. So Turkish housewife told us, well, if you can get me a detergent that is safer on the hands or better for my kids for the fumes, that's what I want to pay more for. And then when we ask, yeah, but what about the lakes and the rivers that you pour your pollution in, they're like, well, that's the government's responsibility, not mine. So it turns out that the word environment was very different. And so that research helped us then to go back and do some better follow-up research. So probably nothing that new to you, but was very interesting to us in this quantitative research. The other thing that was very interesting in terms of research and advertising, and this is a quote from Mindshare, consumers in emerging markets are more likely to talk about any kind of online, and by the way, also offline advertising. So what you will feel, and so I'm just now talking from my Turkish experience, but I put a few data on there from Brazil, India, and China. And I have individualism as a cultural dimension and trust in advertising. So people in most emerging markets will tell you that they trust advertising a lot more, both offline and online, than people in mature markets, which is a wonderful opportunity. And the same goes for research. So I've been kind of calling up people as the typical TD marketing around 6 o'clock dinner time. In Germany and the US, people are not that happy with that. And when you get an answering machine and you see, well, please call us back, nobody ever does. In some remote places in Turkey, people surprise us by calling back and saying, yes, I want my opinion to be heard because no company has ever asked me about what I think about this. So in terms of getting focus groups together and so forth and getting opinions, that was really nice. And so likewise, people discuss it more. Turkey is still now, I think, the 4th Facebook nation worldwide, just in terms of sheer numbers. And then even within Facebook, you see a much bigger willingness to discuss brands online. Whereas Western European and US countries, a big part of people who go on Facebook are very annoyed when you as a commercial company try to get into the conversation. So both the willingness to give good answers to research questions and how people react to advertising and commercial interests are different, in my opinion. And just give you one example then finally about how people decide. So I teach a lot of executive MBA students. And so what happened in the US, people, if they would decide on an elective, they would basically ask the people who were there before how good the teachers were. But then they would have to have these individual bidding functions, right? So US universities force you to bid for certain electives. So my elective would always have a market share somewhere between, 20% and 80%, let's say. So when I came to my Turkish university, all of my MBA students got together offline somewhere and discussed this and then came back to the dean and said, well, we're either going to take Professor Pauwels' class or not. So my market share was like 0 and 100%. And that really got my attention to the importance of word of mouth and how decision-making is very different. And in this case, then, in research, the importance for a lot of products to bring focus groups together instead of individual consumers. And this works for people with over 6 years of business experience. So if these cultural differences are there for them, I think it's going to be even stronger in the rest of the population. So very briefly about 2 of my projects. This was a very general one. Which kind of message works best in emerging versus mature markets? So we have this experiential route of sensations, feelings, and imaginations. the kind of love mark idea that you all know, and then the functional roots and focusing on product features and benefits. And so this was tested in several Western European countries, including Germany, France, and the Netherlands, I think where most of us are from. And then in 18 emerging countries. And, you know, it is true, and you see that also in research, that these experiential route, the emotions, and going through what we call ad effect in our research, how much people love or like the ad, that had a much bigger impact on purchase intention in mature markets, whereas advertising, specifically the functional benefits, worked both on ad effect and cognition, that people understood what the ad was about, and that both lifted purchase intent in emerging markets. So this as an interesting difference that I found. So in this particular project, because I promised a case study, we went deeper into that one. And so we basically tried to analyze whether this love mark advice that we got from Roberts, that brands have to be romantic, mysterious, and sensual, I left that one out, really applies also to emerging markets. And if that are the things that you should probe for. So if you look at, you know, Mr. Zhu from Lenovo, he basically said, well, in the end, it's really about reliability, good service, and fundamental attributes. So Lenovo got big in China, for instance, not by being sensual and mysterious. They got big by being reliable and having decent service, and then they naturally thought that that would work also in the US, with some very mixed results. So this is typically my research framework. So I start from what marketers do. Then I see what consumers think and feel about us. Apparently, she likes us. But so that I typically measure in these, you know, monthly surveys of a few thousands of consumers per country in terms of awareness, consideration, liking. And then I come up with what customers do. And then so my research focuses on how responsive are these metrics to your marketing actions as a client, and then how do these metrics translate into sales. And so our idea in this work is that both of these steps are fundamentally different in some emerging versus some mature markets. I do realize that I generalize a lot, and you are used to work in specific emerging markets, even in specific regions of emerging markets, right? So I was very interested to find that some of these things apply in Brazil, in Turkey, and in Indonesia to a similar extent. So the things that I do a lot with clients is, you know, we have never been in India, we want to go there. We are in other countries that are culturally or economically similar. Can we say something from those countries that we're already in or we know more about the countries that we're planning to go in? So that is kind of the point where I'm coming from. So that's a study that was just published. So we basically look at how this responsiveness to marketing and conversion to sales is different in an emerging markets, in this case Brazil, and a mature market, in this case the UK. So what does that mean? Responsiveness is, can marketers move the needle, right? So it's fantastic to see that people really have to love your brand in order to buy it, but can you do anything as a marketer to get people to like you? So we basically look at the past. That's my research technique, and I see this. Is there anything that you have done in advertising or other marketing instruments that do this? And then the conversion is, does the fact that people now say on a survey, in my case, that they love you more, or, you know, in a focus group, does that actually translate into more sales and profits for the brand? So that's a very simple 2 steps. So what we did here, we looked both at kind of cultural differences, and these are the typical Hofstede dimensions, but I also use Schwartz and some of the other frameworks. And economic difference, we specifically looked so at income competition and at legal protection. So what you see in a lot of emerging markets is that people are more risk averse before they try your brand. They have to ask their family and friends if they know about the brand. That's very interesting if you're first trying to make it. Whereas in individual markets, people, we basically trust regulation and the government, so that if you go into a supermarket, that every product at least gives you basic quality, right? That it doesn't make you sick. And we find that that's typically not the case in most emerging markets. So that kind of risk aversion, we thought would be very important to people, and we typically tend to overlook that, coming from markets with much better legal protection for consumers. And so we look at how that affects things like advertising awareness. To what extent do you get people to pay attention to your ad enough to remember it? And then consideration and liking for the brand. And then, of course, marketing effectiveness that as a result from these transitions. So what was a specific case? This is a fast-moving consumer goods, personal care, Brazil and the UK. There's two main categories there. It's actually male and female, so that's pretty easy. And there's three brands that have basically the same positioning, also similar market share and price positioning. They also have exactly the same kind of advertising message. These are universal brands with a very kind of strong positioning worldwide. And so we have about 10 years of data recently that is basically monthly, and both has marketing actions of the brands, attitudes, and sales. And we like this kind of setting because it controls for potential other differences. So if you do other work, then your brands may be different. So that's another reason why your findings could be different. And we also found that they have similar potential. So we look at all of these metrics and say, well, of course, if your liking is close to 100%, you don't have much room to grow anymore. But all of these brands had similar starting positions at the beginning of our period. So that's what we looked at. The findings, so these are the two categories and then the total here. So if you looked at advertising response in emerging versus mature markets, so let's say you have a similar 100 gross rating points with a similar message. We see that in both categories, advertising awareness jumps more. So when you ask people, hey, have you seen communication of this brand in, let's say, the last 3 months? We see in both places, specifically for category 1, a bigger jump in the emerging market, which is dark blue here. So we indeed find that people pay more attention to advertising in emerging markets. Yeah, go ahead.
I think also it must be the case in emerging markets that those brands have a much bigger share of voice because there's less noise. In an established market, you're bombarded by apparently 2,000 messages a day from brands and so on. And if I live in Chile, that's not going to be the case. So that has to be factored in.
It depends. So in this particular case, so the 3 brands that we studied had the Gimmelon. Both markets had also 4 local brands that were advertising. So these 4 local brands were different from each other, but in this case, they were a similar level of competition. And you're absolutely right. So the fact that you have a bigger share of voice with the same advertising could explain some of this one. Yeah. So this is really so if you kind of can rule out competition, it says something, I think, about how people block out advertising, different markets.
No, just want to say longer history, of course, with advertising and reactions towards it as well. But
okay. Yeah, that's an excellent point. So the biggest difference we found here was for consideration. So we find that, so you go out with your advertising and then you see how it lifts consideration. And this is within 1 or 2 months. We see that it's this time the mature market that has a much bigger lift. And this we related back in a bigger study in terms of the cultural differences. So if you're pretty much an individual person, right, and some new personal care brand advertises, when we went back and asked people, well, how do you decide on that? People are like, okay, well, they advertise. So once you break through to a mature market consumer in terms of the fact that he or she notices you, right, then you have a pretty good chance to be in the consideration set. And it also has to do with income differences, right? So people don't see much risk in trying your brand. They're like, so if you are X or Old Spice and you're advertising, from the moment you get people to notice you, they're like, yeah, I mean, why won't we try it? What is the worst that can happen? And so when we probe deeper into people in emerging markets, they say, no, we won't consider them yet. We will first ask friends and family to see if they have heard about the brand too. So in those markets, we found that reaching a lot of people was more important than going extremely deep and having lots of exposures at any one individual. So we didn't need that many exposures because people in emerging markets were more open to the advertising. But that they didn't mean that they right away put our brands in the consideration set. So we found some very interesting differences versus reach versus frequency that this company should focus on. And then a very big difference, and this is in the female category, was for liking. So the effect of advertising on people saying we like or we love your brand, and again, so that really came down to how much individually they could make that decision. So some good advertising, and it was the same kind of positioning developed universally, had a much bigger lift on how people love the brand. So that was my story for marketing responsiveness. I mean, this is just, so 2 markets, but we thought it was a very interesting experiment. And we would love to see how that whether it applies to other markets. In terms of sales conversion, advertising awareness was kind of a washout because there were differences between the two categories. So this says if you can lift advertising awareness by 10%, how much do your sales increase? So that's the conversion part of it. So that was kind of a washout on average. Consideration, so emerging markets had a much bigger conversion for consideration than mature markets. So if you do manage to get into people's consideration sets, if they note you down, in this case on a survey among the brands they would consider buying, the impact on sales was larger than in mature markets. And we found exactly the opposite for liking. So we found that in a mature market, the fact that, that people love your brand, you get a 10% lift in that one, had a much bigger impact on your sales. In the emerging market, it was really the hard step to take was getting into people's consideration set. But once you are, they will buy you. And we found that that was a very interesting difference because if you think back about the functional attributes and the experiential attributes, it is true that to get into people's consideration set, you just have to convince them that you're a player in the category, that you're a worthwhile brand. It doesn't have to be, the most favorite brand. Whereas to convince, to get people to love your brand more, that typically takes a much more emotional connection. And then, by the way, one thing that I like to pick out for more qualitative research, we had lots of other questions. One of them is this a brand that costs more than other brands in the category? And so here we found exactly the opposite effect on sales. So if you look at the mature market, which is the lighter version, so if you were a brand that costs more, you had a negative effect on your sales. In this emerging market, if you were a brand that was known to cost more, you had a positive effect on your sales. And again, there we probe deeper, and there it goes into the whole kind of setting that price indicates quality to some people. And in the market where there's little legal protection, and people do look for price as a symbol of, hey, this brand can really deliver the goods, we find this opposite reaction to the survey question, this is a brand that costs more. And so in this sense, so the company was actually thinking about reducing the price in Brazil. And we said, well, you have to be very careful with this one, because actually the fact that you have a higher price point is seen by at least the average consumer here as something positive. And so instead what they did is to have another brand for lower income people. So here was a few points. So my love marks are safe bets, what you now know from the beginning. That goes to, this is just one case study. But what do you really want to be as a brand, and how do you kind of translate that into what you should research for? So if you look at responsiveness to marketing and conversion, and where these metrics fitted, so we found that, for instance, liking in emerging markets had a low sales conversion, and it was also very hard to change with your marketing. So we said, well, maybe this is because your past advertising was not creative enough, so you may want to change that. But maybe there's also something inherent that you can't force it in this emerging market. You can put some elements in place, but people have to go through the whole word of mouth process. Whereas liking in mature markets was both highly responsive to marketing, so the company knew how to kind of move the needle on that one, and it converted very nicely into sales. So we said, well, liking is just a much more important metric on your dashboard to kind of reward or punish your managers in the UK versus in Brazil, where maybe you have to, reward people that can move the needle on consideration more. So consideration had a very high sales conversion, but you have to try to find better ways to stimulate consideration, because the advertising we saw in the past didn't really move the needle yet on this one. So these were just a few of the conclusions we had there. Does this apply to other markets? I'm very much into this branding debate. So at Tuck, I shared 8 years with Kevin Keller, and we had huge discussions about this. And I thought that people, so this is a quote from Lindstrom, who says, well, people in emerging markets companies, they just don't know what a brand is. And so here's this quote. He says, well, so our qualitative research reveals that Chinese consumers feel the need to wear at least 3 branded items to feel comfortable at work. But when you probe them further in qualitative research, they have no idea what to define the features of a brand. They had no difficulty describing the product. It seems that for them the product is the brand. The emotional connection is simply absent. I believe that part, but I don't believe what he said next, that they just don't understand what a brand is. I would say they have another definition of what a brand is to them. So if you look at, for instance, this is Advani from Lenovo, I believe. So he realizes that one. So in China, they grew very big without the big emotional connection because for their market, it was not necessarily. But if you want to make it a global brand and to succeed, for instance, in the United States, they say, well, you know, it's not enough that people know us. They have to have this emotional connections on it. You know, we have to get this deep emotional connection. So that is the other side. This is an emerging market brand that says, hey, we realize that even though emotions were not so important in our home market, we really have to get that connection. And you see that also in their advertising. And so forth. Hyundai is another example of a brand that really does the same transition. So key takeaways before opening up for questions. I think you know the first two. So that I'm like preaching to the choir here, but I teach that to my quantitative researchers too. You be very careful for what words mean exactly. So even if you have the perfect translation and back translation, a word like environment can mean something different, in this case in Germany and Turkey. This higher trust in marketing and research, I don't think is that much known, and you should really exploit it. So the opportunities in emerging markets to do some good research and also get representativeness is probably better than in the mature markets where people are kind of tuning out of research and advertising. Check which attitude translates most in behavior in emerging markets. So don't just assume that because, you know, certain emotional connections are key for a brand in a mature market, they also matter that much in emerging markets. Probe for attitude response to advertising. That could be higher or lower in emerging markets. And having a high price, which may be very bad, you know, in Germany or the UK these days, may actually be a good thing in some emerging markets for some categories. Verified how consideration is driven by online or offline word of mouth. So word of mouth has always been important, but I think in emerging markets in my research, it's more important than the mature markets. And the final thing I hope that you will agree with, right? Is that so I come from the other side, and I typically tell my clients, look, you have very interesting quantitative research, but we do need to validate it by qualitative research, kind of the opposite what was said before. So I question the internal validity of a lot of the work that I do, and I do love this conference to go deeper into how can I combine both of them to get some good insights. And thank you very much.